July 24, 1945. The grand halls of Sicilianhof Palace in Potsdam, Germany. Three men who controlled the fate of the world stood in a room still warm with the ash of war. President Harry Truman, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin were carving up a defeated Germany. But Truman had a secret, or so he thought. 8 days earlier, in the New Mexico desert, American scientists had successfully detonated the most powerful weapon ever created. The Trinity test had proven that the atomic bomb was real. Now, Truman was about to tell Stalin about it, expecting shock, questions, perhaps even fear. Instead, what happened in the next 90 seconds would reveal one of the greatest intelligence coups in history. Stalin's response was so casual, so unconcerned, that Churchill later wrote he seemed delighted, as if Truman had offered him a gift. Stalin simply said he hoped America would make good use of it against the Japanese. No questions, no surprise, no follow-up. Truman walked away confused. Churchill watched in fascination. Neither understood what had just happened. Stalin already knew everything. He had known for years. Soviet spies had infiltrated the Manhattan Project so deeply that Stalin possessed blueprints of the bomb before Truman even knew he would become president. While American scientists raced against time in Los Alamos, Soviet intelligence officers were reading their reports in Moscow. The story of how Stalin stole the atomic bomb is not just about espionage. It is about how information can change the balance of world power, how a handful of individuals with security clearances betrayed their countries, and how the Soviet dictator played the greatest poker face in modern history. Before we dive deeper into this story, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the hidden moments that shaped our world. To understand what happened at Potsdam, we need to go back to 1942. That year, Soviet physicist Georgy Flyorov noticed something strange. He was serving as a lieutenant in the Red Army, and during his downtime, he read American scientific journals. Flyorov had been following nuclear physics research before the war, particularly the groundbreaking work on uranium fission. But suddenly, in 1942, all the American papers on nuclear physics stopped appearing. The silence was deafening. Scientists who had been publishing regularly, names Flyorov recognized, went completely quiet. To Flyorov, this could mean only one thing. The Americans were working on something secret, something big. He wrote directly to Stalin, urging him to start a Soviet nuclear program immediately. But Flyorov's letter was not why Stalin authorized the Soviet atomic project. The real trigger came from British intelligence, passed to Moscow by Soviet spies. In particular, John Cairncross, one of the Cambridge 5 spy ring, provided information that Britain was pursuing atomic weapons. In Stalin's Soviet Union, high-technology projects received priority only when it was confirmed that Western capitalist nations were also working on them. Stalin was not a man who took risks on unproven science, but if the West was building something, Stalin wanted it too. In February 1943, Stalin authorized a small nuclear research program under physicist Igor Kurchatov. Laboratory number 2 was established in Moscow. The program was tiny compared to what would come later, involving perhaps 20 physicists and minimal staff. They studied uranium fission reactions, explored methods for enriching uranium, and investigated plutonium production. But this was still a low-priority project. The Soviet Union was fighting for its survival against Nazi Germany. Resources were scarce. Stalin was not yet convinced that an atomic bomb was actually feasible. That would change completely in 1945. The key to understanding Potsdam is understanding that by July 1945, Soviet intelligence had achieved something remarkable. They had penetrated the Manhattan Project, the most secret military program in American history, at multiple levels. The crown jewel of Soviet espionage was a German-born British physicist named Klaus Fuchs. Fuchs had joined the German Communist Party in 1930 while a student. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Fuchs fled to Britain to escape persecution. He was brilliant. He earned his doctorate in physics from the University of Bristol in 1937 and became a leading theoretical physicist. When Britain began its atomic research program, called Tube Alloys, Fuchs was recruited despite his German origins because his expertise was desperately needed. He became a British citizen in 1942. That same year, Fuchs made contact with Soviet intelligence. Through a German communist named Jürgen Kuczynski, Fuchs was connected to Ursula Burton, codenamed Sonia, a Soviet military intelligence officer. Fuchs began passing detailed information about British atomic research to the Soviets. His motivation was ideological. Fuchs believed that knowledge of atomic weapons should not be the monopoly of any single nation. He saw it as sharing information with an ally against fascism. In 1943, Britain and the United States signed the Quebec Agreement to combine their atomic programs. Fuchs was sent to New York to work on the Manhattan Project. He worked initially at Columbia University on gaseous diffusion methods for enriching uranium. Then in August 1904, Fuchs was transferred to Los Alamos, the heart of the bomb project. At Los Alamos, Fuchs worked in the Theoretical Physics Division under Hans Bethe, one of the greatest physicists of the century. Fuchs specialized in implosion methods, the technique needed to detonate a plutonium bomb. This was absolutely critical work. The implosion design was extraordinarily complex, requiring precise calculations about how conventional explosives could compress a plutonium core to critical mass. Fuchs was at the center of this research. His handler in the United States was Harry Gold, an American chemist who had been working for Soviet intelligence since 1934. Gold used the codename Raymond. Fuchs and Gold met regularly in New York City and Santa Fe, New Mexico. In these meetings, Fuchs handed over some of the most sensitive information imaginable. He provided detailed descriptions of the Fat Man plutonium bomb design, including the implosion system, the plutonium core configuration, and calculations about the explosive yield. He gave the Soviets information about uranium enrichment processes, about the facilities at Oak Ridge and Hanford, about the scientific leadership of the project. Fuchs even provided information about early work on the hydrogen bomb, though this would prove less useful since the key breakthroughs had not yet been made. The information Fuchs provided was extraordinarily valuable. Igor Kurchatov, who received Fuchs's reports, later told colleagues that the intelligence allowed Soviet scientists to avoid dangerous experiments that had cost American researchers time and lives. For instance, American scientists had conducted risky criticality experiments called tickling the dragon's tail to determine the critical mass of plutonium. These tests were performed by bringing two hemispheres of plutonium close together to measure when a chain reaction would begin. The experiments were incredibly dangerous. In 1945, physicist Harry Daghlian died from radiation exposure after accidentally dropping a tungsten carbide brick onto a plutonium core. In 1946, Louis Slotin died in a similar accident. Thanks to Fuchs, Soviet scientists did not need to repeat these deadly experiments. They already knew the answers, but Fuchs was not alone. The Soviets had another spy at Los Alamos, and this one was even younger. Theodore Hall was born Theodore Holtzberg in 1925 in Far Rockaway, New York. His family was Jewish, and his father had emigrated from Russia to escape anti-Semitic pogroms. Hall was extraordinarily gifted. He graduated from high school at 14 and entered Harvard University. By 18, he had completed his undergraduate degree in physics. In January 1904, on the recommendation of a professor, Hall was recruited to Los Alamos. He became the youngest physicist on the Manhattan Project. At Los Alamos, Hall was assigned to work on the implosion bomb. He helped determine the critical mass of uranium for the Little Boy bomb and conducted experiments on the plutonium implosion system for Fat Man. Despite his youth, Hall was put in charge of a team working on the implosion problem. He was described by colleagues as amazingly brilliant. By the summer of 1904, Hall had become deeply concerned about American monopoly on atomic weapons. The war in Europe was turning in favor of the Allies. It was clear Germany would not develop an atomic bomb. Hall feared that if only the United States possessed nuclear weapons after the war, it would lead to catastrophic consequences. He made a decision that would alter Cold War history. In October 1904, Hall traveled to New York City on the pretext of celebrating his 19th birthday. He went to the offices of Amtorg, the Soviet trade company, which was a known front for Soviet intelligence. There, Hall made contact with Soviet agents. He provided them with an organizational chart of Los Alamos, detailing how the project was structured, who the key scientists were, and what areas they were working on. This initial contact established Hall's bona fides with Moscow. Hall's courier was Saville Sachs, his Harvard roommate who had communist sympathies. Over the following months, Hall passed detailed technical information to the Soviets through Sachs or directly to Soviet agents in New York. He provided specifications of the Fat Man bomb, information about plutonium production and purification processes, and updates on the progress of the implosion design. His intelligence was independent of Fuchs's reports, which meant Moscow Center received corroboration from two separate sources. This gave Soviet leaders confidence that the information was genuine and not disinformation. Hall's handler in New York was Anatoly Yatskov, the NKVD station chief. The information Hall provided made its way to Moscow using one-time pad ciphers, which the Soviets believed were unbreakable. Hall's codename was Mlad. He continued passing information even after the Trinity test in July 1945. He gave the Soviets details about the test results, about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and about early discussions of the hydrogen bomb. There were other spies too. David Greenglass, a U.S. Army machinist at Los Alamos, provided crude schematics of bomb components to his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg, who ran a Soviet spy network. While Greenglass's information was less sophisticated than what Fuchs and Hall provided, it still offered useful confirmation of design details. By mid-1945, the Soviet Union had assembled a remarkably complete picture of the American atomic bomb program. Intelligence reports flowed into Moscow from multiple sources, cross-referencing and validating each other. Lavrentiy Beria, head of the NKVD and political overseer of the Soviet atomic project, had access to design blueprints, technical specifications, lists of materials, organizational charts, and progress reports. Igor Kurchatov studied this intelligence carefully. He could see that the Americans were close to success. Then came Trinity. On July 16, 1945, in the desert near Alamogordo, New Mexico, the world's first atomic bomb was detonated. The plutonium implosion device, the gadget, exploded with a yield of about 22 kilotons of TNT equivalent. The test was a complete success. A message was sent to President Truman, who was already in Europe preparing for the Potsdam Conference. Truman arrived in Potsdam on July 15th. The Trinity test occurred the next day. On July 17th, Truman received a detailed report confirming the test's success. Now Truman faced a decision. Should he tell Stalin about the bomb? There had been extensive debate in Washington about this question. Some advisors believed the Soviet Union, as a wartime ally, should be informed. Vannevar Bush and James Conant, two of Roosevelt's chief scientific advisors, had argued for sharing information with Moscow to avoid poisoning post-war relations. The Interim Committee, which advised on atomic policy, recommended that Truman inform Stalin at Potsdam that the United States was working on a powerful new weapon and expected to use it against Japan, without providing technical details. Truman and his Secretary of State, James Burns, were more cautious. They saw the atomic bomb as potential leverage in negotiations with Stalin. The Soviet Union had committed to entering the war against Japan 3 months after Germany's surrender, which meant by August 1945. But with the bomb, the United States might not need Soviet help to force Japan's surrender. Truman wanted Stalin to know the United States had this capability, hoping it would make the Soviet leader more accommodating on issues like Poland and Eastern Europe. But Truman did not want to reveal too much. He decided to mention the bomb casually, without using the word atomic and without providing details. July 24, 1945. The afternoon plenary session of the Potsdam Conference had just ended. The Big Three and their delegations were preparing to leave. Truman walked around the large circular conference table to where Stalin stood. Winston Churchill watched intently from about 5 yards away. Churchill knew what Truman was about to do. He wanted to measure Stalin's reaction. Truman, through his interpreter, told Stalin that the United States had developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. He did not say atomic bomb. He did not explain the technology. He simply said the United States had this new weapon and planned to use it against Japan unless Japan surrendered. Stalin's response was remarkably brief. He said he was glad to hear it and hoped the United States would make good use of it against the Japanese. That was all. No questions, no request for details, no expression of surprise. Truman shook hands with Stalin and walked back to where Secretary of State Burns was waiting. Churchill, watching carefully, saw Stalin's face. Churchill later wrote that Stalin seemed delighted, as if Truman had given him good news about a new tool that would help end the war. As they waited for their cars, Churchill approached Truman. "How did it go?" Churchill asked. "He never asked a question," Truman replied. "He seemed satisfied." Truman and Burns discussed Stalin's reaction as they drove back to their residence. Burns had expected Stalin to ask follow-up questions once he returned to his quarters and had time to think about what Truman had said. They anticipated that Stalin would want to know more. They even discussed how much additional information Truman should be willing to share if Stalin pressed for details. But Stalin never asked. No Soviet representative sought clarification. No diplomatic inquiry arrived. The subject was simply dropped. To Truman and his advisors, this suggested that Stalin had not understood the significance of what Truman was telling him. Churchill later wrote that he was certain Stalin had no special knowledge of the atomic bomb at that time. Churchill believed Stalin thought it was just another conventional weapon, perhaps larger or more efficient, but nothing revolutionary. They were completely wrong. That night, back at his villa, Stalin did not rush to his bedroom in confusion or ignorance. Instead, he immediately called Lavrenti Beria. The conversation that followed has been documented by multiple Soviet sources. Stalin told Beria that Truman had mentioned a powerful new weapon. Stalin's comment was sharp and cynical. "They think we are fools," Stalin said. He told Beria to contact Kurchatov immediately. The message was clear and urgent. Speed up the work. Do not let the Americans get ahead. Stalin knew exactly what Truman had been talking about. He knew it was the atomic bomb. He had known about the Manhattan Project for years. His intelligence services had been feeding him detailed reports about American progress. Stalin's calm response at Potsdam was not ignorance. It was calculated. He did not want to reveal to Truman that Soviet intelligence had penetrated the Manhattan Project. Showing surprise would have been the honest reaction of someone learning shocking news. By remaining completely unfazed, Stalin signaled nothing. He gave Truman no indication that the Soviet Union understood the nature of the weapon or that they had any knowledge of American atomic research. It was a masterclass in deception. The Soviet archives and memoirs published after the Cold War revealed the truth about Stalin's reaction. Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister who was present when Truman approached Stalin, later described the scene. Molotov said Truman took him and Stalin aside with what seemed like a secretive manner. Truman told them the United States had a special weapon that had never existed before, something extraordinary. Molotov noted that Truman never specifically said atomic bomb, but the Soviets understood immediately what he meant. According to Molotov, it seemed like Truman wanted to shock them, to intimidate them. Stalin reacted very calmly, which made Truman think Stalin did not understand. But Molotov and Stalin knew exactly what Truman was talking about. They saw it as a veiled threat, an attempt at political blackmail. Stalin had no intention of showing his hand. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commander of Soviet forces in Germany and one of Stalin's closest military advisors at Potsdam, also left an account. Zhukov believed Truman's approach to Stalin was obviously intended as political pressure, but Stalin gave away nothing, acting as if Truman's announcement was of no particular importance. The American bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9th confirmed everything Soviet intelligence had reported. The destructive power, the technology, the strategic implications, all of it matched what Fuchs and Hall had described. But even before Hiroshima, Stalin had already made his decision. In the immediate aftermath of Potsdam, Stalin began accelerating the Soviet atomic program. On August 20th, 1945, Stalin issued a top-secret decree authorizing a massive expansion of atomic research and development. The decree appointed Lavrenti Beria to take complete control of the program. This was significant. Beria was not a scientist. He was the head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, one of the most feared and ruthless figures in Stalin's inner circle. Beria's appointment signaled that the atomic project was now a top national priority. Failure would not be tolerated. Resources would be unlimited. The project would have authority to commandeer materials, labor, and facilities from anywhere in the Soviet Union. Stalin's directive to Kurchatov was simple. Ask for whatever you need. You will not be refused. If a child does not cry, Stalin told Kurchatov, the mother does not know what the child needs. This was Stalin's way of saying that Kurchatov should demand everything necessary and more. The Soviet Union, still devastated by the war, would divert resources from reconstruction to build the bomb. An estimated 26 million Soviet citizens had died in the war. Another 25 million were homeless. Major cities were flattened. Industrial capacity was shattered. The economy was in ruins. Yet Stalin was prepared to allocate enormous resources to the atomic project, even at the cost of delaying recovery. Beria organized the program with characteristic brutality and efficiency. He established a special committee to oversee all aspects of atomic work. General Boris Vanikov headed the engineering side, comparable to General Leslie Groves in the American program. Kurchatov remained the scientific director. Soviet intelligence intensified its efforts to obtain more information from the West. Beria ordered his agents to gather complete technical and economic information about uranium mining, processing, enrichment, reactor design, and bomb assembly. The Soviet atomic program grew rapidly. Laboratory number 2 in Moscow expanded dramatically. New facilities were built in the Ural Mountains. A secret city was constructed at Artemis-16, roughly 250 miles east of Moscow, to serve as the Soviet equivalent of Los Alamos. The town was erased from maps. Scientists and engineers working there disappeared from public view. They were well paid and provided privileges unavailable to ordinary Soviet citizens, but they lived under constant surveillance. In 1946, construction began on the first Soviet nuclear reactor at a facility called Chelyabinsk 40, later known as Mayak. This reactor would produce plutonium for weapons. The Soviets also began building gaseous diffusion plants for uranium enrichment. Tens of thousands of Gulag prisoners were sent to work in uranium mines in Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Siberia. The labor was brutal. Many prisoners died from exposure, malnutrition, or radiation. The Soviet program benefited immensely from espionage. The intelligence provided by Fuchs in particular gave Soviet scientists detailed blueprints of the Fat Man bomb. Beria and Kurchatov were initially suspicious of the intelligence, fearing it might be disinformation. They insisted that Soviet scientists independently verify everything, but the information proved accurate. Soviet scientists were able to skip many of the trial and error steps that had consumed years of American effort. By 1948, the Soviet program had progressed to the point where bomb assembly was being planned. Yuli Kharatun was appointed chief designer of the weapon. The decision was made to build a near-exact copy of Fat Man for the first test. This was partly because Soviet leaders wanted a guaranteed success, and partly because they trusted the American design that had been proven at Trinity and Nagasaki. On December 25, 1946, the Soviets achieved their first sustained nuclear chain reaction in a graphite reactor, roughly following the design of Chicago Pile 1. Plutonium production began in 1948. By early 1949, enough weapons-grade plutonium had been produced for a bomb test. In May 1949, Kurchatov arrived at the test site in Semipalatinsk, in northeastern Kazakhstan. The location was chosen for its remoteness. The Soviets constructed a test tower similar to the one used at Trinity. They also built structures around the test site, including wooden houses, brick buildings, bridges, tunnels, and water towers, to study the effects of the blast. They placed caged animals at various distances to measure radiation exposure and injury. In mid-August, Beria arrived at the site to oversee final preparations. He reported directly to Stalin. On the night of August 28, 1949, the bomb was assembled and transported to the tower. The detonation was scheduled for 6 a.m. on August 29th. Kurchatov and a small group of scientists gathered in the command bunker with Beria and his entourage. They left the bunker door open so they could watch the explosion, knowing they would have about 30 seconds to close the door before the shockwave arrived. At 7 a.m. Moscow time, Kurchatov gave the order. The bomb detonated. The flash of light illuminated the surrounding hills. The fireball rose into the sky, forming the characteristic mushroom cloud. As the shockwave approached, the scientists closed the bunker door and felt the ground shake. When they emerged, they saw the devastation. The mock structures were obliterated. The test animals were incinerated. The yield was approximately 22 kilotons, nearly identical to the American Fat Man bomb. It was a complete success. Beria immediately called Stalin in Moscow. It was just after 5 a.m. in Moscow, and Stalin was still asleep. When his secretary woke him to say Beria was on the line with urgent news, Stalin was irritated. "What do you want?" Stalin demanded. "Why are you calling me?" Beria said everything went right. Stalin replied that he already knew and hung up. This exchange revealed Stalin's paranoia. He had his own intelligence network, watching Beria and the atomic project. Stalin trusted no one. He had learned about the successful test through his own channels before Beria called. By claiming he already knew, Stalin reminded Beria that he was always being watched. But this was Stalin's way. He kept multiple intelligence agencies spying on each other and reporting directly to him. The successful test was not immediately announced. The Soviet Union wanted to keep it secret as long as possible, but the Americans had been expecting this. Since 1947, the U.S. Air Force had been operating a secret detection system using specially equipped weather reconnaissance aircraft. These WB-29 superfortresses carried filters designed to collect atmospheric particles. If the Soviets tested a bomb, radioactive debris would be carried by winds across the Pacific, and American planes would detect it. On September 3, 1949, a WB-29 flying from Japan to Alaska collected air samples that showed abnormal radioactivity. Over the following days, additional flights confirmed the readings. The samples were analyzed by Tracer Lab, a contractor for the Air Force Office of Atomic Energy, and independently by scientists at Los Alamos, including Roderick Spence, who headed the radiochemistry group. The analyses showed radioactive isotopes consistent with plutonium fission. The conclusion was inescapable. The Soviet Union had detonated an atomic bomb. President Truman was informed on September 9th, but he was initially skeptical. American intelligence had estimated that the Soviets would not have a bomb until 1953 at the earliest. Some thought 1954 was more likely. The idea that the Soviets had succeeded in 1949, only 4 years after the war, seemed impossible. But as more data came in, the evidence became overwhelming. The decay products, the isotope ratios, the timing, everything pointed to a nuclear explosion in late August. On September 21st, Air Force Chief of Staff Hoyt Vandenberg presented the final analysis to Truman. Vandenberg stated his belief that an atomic bomb had been detonated over the Asiatic landmass between August 26th and August 29th, 1949. Scientists from the Atomic Energy Commission confirmed the findings. Truman could no longer deny it. The Soviet Union had the bomb. On September 23, 1949, Truman made a brief public announcement. He said the United States had evidence that within recent weeks an atomic explosion had occurred in the Soviet Union. Truman's statement was carefully worded. He did not provide details about how the test was detected, the estimated yield, or the location. He emphasized that this development had always been expected, that scientists had long known other nations could build atomic weapons given time. He called for international control of atomic energy. The announcement shocked the American public and sent ripples through the international community. The U.S. nuclear monopoly was over. The Cold War was about to become infinitely more dangerous. Truman's announcement apparently surprised the Soviets, who had hoped to keep the test secret. They did not know about the American detection system. The Soviet government issued a statement suggesting that what the Americans had detected might have been signatures from large-scale excavation or construction projects, not a bomb test. But the statement also asserted that the Soviet Union possessed atomic weapons and had possessed the secret of atomic energy for some time. This was a deliberate attempt to create ambiguity about when the Soviets had achieved nuclear capability. Within the United States, the shock of the Soviet bomb led to immediate questions. How had they done it so quickly? What did this mean for American security? The answer came soon enough. In 1950, British and American intelligence, working from decrypted Soviet communications from the Venona project, identified Klaus Fuchs as a Soviet spy. Venona was a top-secret U.S. and British effort to decrypt Soviet diplomatic and intelligence communications. Starting in 1943, American and British codebreakers had been intercepting Soviet messages and trying to break their encryption. The Soviets used one-time pad ciphers, which should have been unbreakable. But Soviet cipher clerks had made errors, reusing some key pages. This allowed cryptanalysts to make partial breaks. By 1946, Meredith Gardner, an analyst with the U.S. Army Signal Intelligence Service, had decrypted portions of Soviet messages from 1904 and 1945. On December 20, 1946, Gardner broke a message that contained a list of scientists working on the Manhattan Project. The source was clearly someone with high-level access. Over the next few years, more messages were decrypted. They revealed extensive Soviet espionage against the atomic program. Code names appeared. Charles and Rest referred to the same person, someone providing detailed technical information from Los Alamos. By 1949, British and American investigators had narrowed the suspects. Klaus Fuchs was arrested in Britain in February 1950. Fuchs initially denied everything, but after several interrogations by MI5 officer William Scardon, Fuchs confessed. He admitted passing information to the Soviet Union since 1941. He provided details about his meetings with Harry Gold and the information he had transmitted. Fuchs was tried in Britain under the Official Secrets Act. Because the Soviet Union had been a wartime ally, not an enemy, at the time of his spying, he could not be charged with treason. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison, the maximum under the Official Secrets Act. Fuchs served 9 years and was released in 1959. He then moved to East Germany, where he resumed work as a physicist and became an honored figure. Harry Gold was arrested in the United States in May 1950. He confessed to his role as a courier for Fuchs and other spies. Gold's confession led investigators to David Greenglass, who in turn implicated his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg. The Rosenberg case became one of the most controversial episodes of the Cold War. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were arrested, tried, and convicted of espionage. They were executed in 1953. Many historians believe Ethel Rosenberg was not significantly involved, and that her prosecution was an attempt to pressure Julius to confess, which he never did. Theodore Hall was identified through Venona decrypts, but the evidence was not strong enough for prosecution, and revealing Venona in court would have compromised the program. Hall was questioned by the FBI in 1951, but was never charged. He moved to England in 1962 and lived there until his death in 1999. Hall never fully admitted his espionage, though he came close in a 1997 statement, saying he had felt strongly that an American monopoly on nuclear weapons was dangerous. The role of espionage in the Soviet bomb project has been debated ever since. Some historians argue that Soviet scientists were talented enough to build the bomb on their own, and that espionage merely saved them time, perhaps a year or two. Others argue that the espionage was critical and saved the Soviets significantly more time. David Holloway, in his authoritative book Stalin and the Bomb, published in 1994, concluded that espionage probably saved the Soviet Union between 6 months and 2 years. Without the intelligence from Fuchs and Hall, the Soviets would have had to conduct more experiments, test more designs, and waste resources on dead ends. One key contribution of espionage was avoiding the criticality accidents that killed American scientists. Kurchatov himself acknowledged that knowing the critical mass values from Fuchs's reports meant Soviet scientists did not have to perform the dangerous tickling the dragon experiments. The intelligence also confirmed for Soviet leaders that the bomb was feasible. Before the Trinity test, there was theoretical uncertainty about whether an implosion bomb would actually work. Fuchs's reports resolved that uncertainty. Soviet leaders knew the Americans had succeeded, which gave them confidence to invest enormous resources. After the success of the first Soviet test, RDS-1, Stalin showered honors on the participants. Kurchatov and Khariton were named heroes of socialist labor. Scientists and engineers received substantial cash bonuses, special housing, and cars. Beria reportedly made a list of everyone involved in the project, noting next to each name what punishment they would have received if the test had failed. Executions, imprisonment in the Gulag, all of it was planned. Failure was not an option under Stalin. Success meant rewards. Failure meant death. The Soviet nuclear program continued to expand. In September 1951, the Soviets tested RDS-2, an improved bomb design. In August 1953, they tested RDS-6, a thermonuclear device using a layer cake design that produced a yield of 400 kilotons. The United States tested its first true hydrogen bomb, codenamed Mike, in November 1952, with a yield of over 10 megatons. The nuclear arms race was fully underway, but it all traced back to that moment in Potsdam. Stalin's calm reaction when Truman told him about the bomb was not ignorance. It was the culmination of years of successful espionage. Stalin knew more about the American atomic bomb in July 1945 than Truman did. Truman had been president for less than 4 months. He was not briefed on the Manhattan Project until after Roosevelt's death. Stalin, by contrast, had been receiving detailed intelligence reports since 1942. He understood the science. He knew the organizational structure. He had copies of the blueprints. Soviet spies had given Stalin something more valuable than the bomb itself. They had given him foreknowledge. When Truman tried to use the bomb as a diplomatic weapon at Potsdam, Stalin was unimpressed because he already knew what the United States had. The atomic age began with deception. Truman thought he was revealing a secret. Churchill thought he was witnessing a historic moment of surprise. Stalin knew he was concealing the greatest intelligence victory of the 20th century. The moment at Potsdam encapsulated the early Cold War. Allies who had fought together against fascism were now adversaries, spying on each other, building weapons to deter each other, locked in a struggle that would define the next 4 decades. The atomic bomb did not prevent the Cold War. In some ways, it accelerated it. But the balance of terror, the concept of mutually assured destruction, may have prevented the Cold War from becoming a hot war. If the United States had maintained a nuclear monopoly for many years, as American leaders expected, it is possible that temptation to use that advantage could have led to conflict. Stalin's possession of the bomb, achieved through espionage, created a rough parity sooner than anyone anticipated. That parity forced caution. The story of Stalin and the bomb reveals how intelligence, secrecy, and scientific knowledge intersect with power. It shows that information can be as valuable as weapons. It demonstrates that even in totalitarian systems, individuals can make choices that alter history. Whether those individuals are scientists like Fuchs and Hall, who believed they were preventing war, or intelligence officers like Beria, who sought power, or dictators like Stalin, who trusted no one but played the game with ruthless skill. The legacy of this moment is still with us. The nuclear weapons built by the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War still exist. Russia and America still maintain thousands of warheads. The knowledge of how to build nuclear weapons has spread to other nations. The danger that nuclear weapons could be used, either by states or by terrorists, remains. And it all began with a conversation in Potsdam, where one man told another about a new weapon, and the other man pretended not to know what he was hearing, all while planning to build the same weapon and ensure that no nation would ever have a monopoly on the power to destroy the world.